Welcome back to Epistemology and the Search for Truth, and we have another week of logical fallacies. The excitement never stops. So our first logical fallacy this week is begging the claim or begging the question, which is a form of circular reasoning. This happens when the premise of someone's argument assumes the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. We are begging the claim or question when we assume without proof the stand we are taking in an argument. Using this kind of argument is ultimately unpersuasive because you're not actually adding anything to your argument. It would be like saying the iPhone 11 Pro is the most expensive because it has the highest price. If your argument assumes its premise is true, then you are probably begging the claim or the question. For example, this one happens a lot with the Bible. The Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God because it says right in the 3rd chapter of 2 Timothy that all Scripture is given by divine inspiration of God. Now, this is an okay faith statement, absolutely. If your starting point is faith that the Bible is divinely inspired, it's a great statement to make. But it's not a logical argument. Too often Christians try to make arguments to prove faith in Christianity, but that's not how faith works. C.S. Lewis tried this for a while, but eventually he gave up after he got embarrassed multiple times by people tearing apart his fallacious arguments. If all in a discussion had the same premise about the Bible, then you can point to things in the Bible as kind of evidence for where you're going. But if others aren't working from the same premise, you'll find yourself begging the claim by arguing the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true. It isn't a compelling logical argument. That'd be like me saying the First Presbyterian Methodist Lutheran Church downtown is the one and only true church because the church says so in its founding charter that it is. Our next logical fallacy is often used. It's important to realize this is the ad hominem attack. This fallacy occurs when someone irrelevantly attacks a person or some aspect of the person instead of addressing that person's argument or position. The attack could also be directed at a group of people. This logical fallacy is where prejudice often shows up. We play on people's prejudices and fears about people or groups of people to sway opinions rather than actually address arguments or positions. I see this happen when Christians don't deal with the substance of an idea but assume it's bad because it was suggested by godless liberals or bigoted conservatives. Christians way too often attack the person or the group instead of actually addressing the argument. Historically, we've done this to Christians, Jews, Muslims, and more. I've often heard Christians decry Islam by attacking a small group of Muslims. Example: Islam is a bad religion because its followers are oppressive and violent. In this example, the author is attacking an entire religion based on the actions of some of its followers. Christians hate when others equate Christianity with the worst examples of Christians, yet we often find ourselves doing the same thing. For example, the Reformation was bad because Martin Luther was cruel towards women. In this example, instead of actually dealing with the arguments of the Reformation, the author is judging the entire Reformation based on oversimplifying and sensationalizing a negative aspect of one of its leaders. Another example: I don't need to respond to Mrs. Franklin's concern about the recent church decision because she is ignorant and annoying. In this example, instead of dealing directly with the concern, the author dismisses it because of his or her views about Mrs. Franklin. We shouldn't attack the person or group, but deal directly with the argument or the position on its own merits. This is important in politics all the time, where now we basically see if one political party suggests something, we just attack the person who's making the suggestion or the bill or the law instead of actually looking at the bill or the law. And both sides do this all the time. It happens in churches, it happens in groups, it happens all the time. The ad hominem attack, we attack the person instead of looking at the merits of the argument. The next logical fallacy is a very common one, the red herring. The name comes from the sport of fox hunting, where dragging a dried smoked herring, which is red in color, across the trail of the fox would throw the hounds off the scent. So a red herring is something which distracts the audience from the issue in question. We commit this fallacy when we divert attention from the real issue by focusing instead on an issue having only maybe surface relevance to the first. It's a diversionary tactic that avoids the key issues, often by avoiding opposing arguments rather than addressing them. We often distract people by using highly charged emotional overtures to take the conversation or argument in a totally different direction. For example, Pastor, I've been really struggling since breaking my leg and not being able to live how I'm used to. And then the person says, well, think about all the people with terminal diagnoses who are facing their own death. Your problems won't seem so significant then. That's not what the pastor should do. But we do this all the time. We try to distract people from their problems by appealing to larger ones that make them feel guilty about feeling bad about their own problems. This doesn't actually address this church member's real and valid concern. It's just a red herring. Another example. It is currently unsafe to go to work and leave our homes right now. And somebody else says, but what about people who are stuck at home with abusers? The response is a red herring because it doesn't actually address the issue of whether it is safe or not to go to work. It diverts attention away from the core of the argument to an issue that appeals to emotions as a sensationalized issue. While the issue of abuse is important and would need to be discussed, it's still diversionary in this instance. We see this a lot, based on even the things that happened January 6th. Somebody says, well, what about the stuff that happened this summer? That's a red herring because the two aren't equated. There may be similarities to some of the Black Lives Matter protest and the riot in D.C. on January 6th. There were riots in Portland over the summer, riots in D.C. There are some similarities, but there's also a whole lot of differences in different circumstances. So when someone is trying to talk about one, and somebody says, well, what about this? Let's talk about this. You're diverting attention away. So if somebody's challenging a response to some of the things that were happening in Portland, and someone says, well, what about, what happened in D.C.? You're not dealing with Portland. You're trying to divert attention away to something else. This happens all the time. We don't like the thrust of an argument or a question. We divert it another way. The next logical fallacy, the straw man, is one of the most common, especially in politics. A straw man fallacy occurs when someone takes another person's argument or point, distorts it or exaggerates it in some kind of extreme way, and then attacks the extreme distortion as if that is really the claim the first person is making. We are guilty of straw man, straw person argument when we oversimplify our opponent's viewpoint and then attack that hollow argument of our own creation. By committing this fallacy, we often make our opponent seem extreme, but when they do the same thing back and the public can falsely believe they are faced with a choice between two unappealing extremes, neither of which are really accurate or true. It's like we have to choose between fascism or communism. Those are not our current political choices right now. But if you listen to these two sides, they each paint the other side as all extremely conservative to the point of fascism, or all extremely liberal to the point of socialism or communism. That's not the reality. For example, some might say those who don't want to wear a mask want to kill all older and sick people. There are plenty of logically and scientifically based arguments to challenge someone who thinks mask wearing is bad, unhelpful, or dangerous. This argument just weakens the author's position because it isn't dealing with any actual facts. But that's something I actually saw last spring when masks were beginning to actually start being worn. I seriously doubt anyone who is against masks would say it's because they want to kill older, sick people. We create these strawman arguments and say, hey, look, we are tearing down those arguments. Look, it's a zinger. We see these in memes all the time. We make it seem like somebody wants or thinks something, and maybe no one has even said this before, but we make it appear like a group of people want something, and then we can score political points or whatnot. See, this never actually helps move dialogue forward. It just drives a wedge between the two sides, forcing them further to the extremes. It can also end up being dangerous because too often people believe straw man arguments and then act upon them. People may truly believe those who don't want to wear masks want to kill old people. I wish it weren't true, but people buy into strawman arguments all the time. I constantly see things on Facebook where people are like, oh no, this group of these people want to do this. It's completely made up, but people actually believe it because, well, it's on Facebook or it's in a meme, so it must be true. Another example. The reason we can't sing religious Christmas songs at the school winter Christmas concert is because there's a war on Christmas, and soon it will be illegal to say Merry Christmas, and no mention of Jesus will be allowed on the radio. I wish I were making this up, but alas, no. I see this every single year. This is a very common example of the straw man argument in Christian circles. We create this fictitious enemy that wants to outlaw any mention of Jesus at Christmas and any mention of Christmas at the holiday season. I could have a whole post on this, but I'll refrain. There are logical arguments for not having religious songs sung at school or state-sponsored gatherings. Whether you agree or disagree with those arguments or not, the argument usually isn't focused on erasing Christianity or making it illegal. There may be some people that think, Jesus shouldn't ever be mentioned on public radio waves, but for the most part, there isn't this big, large, concerted effort. What happens is we make a fictitious enemy seem worse than it is, and then we can say, hey, look, we're the victims here. We have to raise more money or whatever it is. Unfortunately, people create this extremist, fictitious enemy to attack, and it works. It works really well, which is why people continue to use straw man arguments. Take issues around the Second Amendment. Both sides try to paint the other as extremists, and while there are a few on the fringes of each side, for the most part, people are actually closer to the middle. But to hear the other side talk, all gun owners want complete, unrestricted access to all kinds of guns and want to be able to carry them wherever they want and shoot whoever they want, and all gun control advocates want to come into your house and take away all your guns. For the most part, neither of those statements are true, and yet those are straw man arguments each side pummels on every year. And in the meantime, we think we live in a country of extremists. See, I have a rule about really volatile, emotionally charged arguments. Before someone is allowed to speak against another person's view, opinion, argument, they have to restate in their own words their opponent's viewpoint to the satisfaction of their opponent. This helps keep people from creating straw man arguments. The next logical fallacy is the false dilemma. This is when we try to force an either-or choice without considering there may be other possibilities. We are presented with a false dilemma when only two choices are presented, yet more exist, or a spectrum of possible choices exists between two extremes. False dilemmas are usually characterized by either this or that language, but can also be characterized by omissions of choices. Another variety is the false trilemma, which is when three choices are presented when more exist. So I've talked a lot about the dangers of binaries, and often binary thinking is guilty of creating a false dilemma. The false dilemma is dangerous because it's all or nothing thinking forces people into thinking they must choose between two extremes. It's my way or the highway of logical fallacies. Example, America, love it or leave it. This is often stated when people critique or question aspects of the United States. It's used to present the false dilemma that you have to be fully supportive of everything about the country or you should leave. This just isn't true. You can love America and recognize there are problems that need to be addressed and changed. Sometimes the best way to love is to be willing to critique. But when people say this, they're trying to make people seem like enemies of the country or unpatriotic because love is equated with 100% blind support. Another example, we either worship in person or we can't worship at all and we shut down the church. This is a false dilemma because there are other ways to worship. We've learned that this year at Derry. Many of the members of Derry haven't been able to physically come to church for years. Should the church not still exist for them? Are they not true members? We've also seen great creativity from churches as they consider how they can still worship while not physically gathered together. It doesn't have to be a choice between gather in person or close the church. That's a false dilemma. Most choices are not binary. We tend to try to oversimplify and create a false dilemma in an effort to force people to choose what we want them to choose. But there's often more than one right answer or a spectrum to the thought. If someone presents you with a false dilemma, then they're probably trying to manipulate you. Next up is the bandwagon fallacy. This is the everyone's doing it, so should you fallacy. It's a fallacy that promotes the popular opinion is therefore the right opinion. The fallacy is based on the assumption that the opinion of the majority is always valid. That is, everyone believes it, so you should too. It is also called an appeal to popularity, the authority of the many, and argumentum ad populum, Latin for appeal of the people. But this fallacy only shows an opinion or position is popular, not necessarily correct. Appeals to popularity are basically hasty conclusion fallacies. The data concerning the popularity of the belief are simply not sufficient to warrant accepting the belief. We inflate the value of popularity as evidence. I see this in Facebook ads all the time, the most recent being, millennials can't stop buying this toothpaste. The ad is hoping that you'll think, man, when have millennials ever been wrong about something? If everyone else is buying it, I'd better check it out too because it must be the best. Historically, Arthur Schopenhauer sourly generalizes, there is no opinion, however absurd, which men will not readily embrace as soon as they can be brought to the conviction that it is generally adopted. An example, the majority of the church believes we should do A. Therefore, we should do A. Well, just because the majority of the church believes we should do something, it may not be a good idea. If the majority of the church believes we should have a petting zoo in the backyard, it still might not be a good idea. We are in a kind of a constitutional government, so often the majority does rule and the majority wins in vote, but it doesn't actually mean it's a good idea or not. I don't think having a petting zoo in the backyard would be a great choice for this church. So, do not be fooled by the bandwagon appeal. It happens all the time. Everyone's thinking this. Most people want this. Everyone's buying this. 9 out of 10 people. That can be part of your decision-making process, but just because a majority of people like or believe something doesn't make it true. If the majority of people believe something happened, if the majority of people believe aliens live among us, it doesn't mean it's true or not. You have to have actual evidence, not just say, hey, the majority of people believe aliens live here. Therefore, aliens live here. That's not actually an argument. Okay, that's 18 minutes of fun logical fallacies. That's probably enough for this week. We'll have a few more next week. I don't want to overwhelm you. There's so many logical fallacies. We could do this for the next year. That's how many logical fallacies there are. But we'll just do one more week of some of these main ones we often see. So thank you again for joining me, and hope you'll come back and check it out next week.